So our next paper is Love in the Therapeutic Alliance. Freud was the foremost among a wide array of Victorian social scientists who explored human love and sexuality. He provided not only a theory but also a method for investigating the most intimate of human emotions with relative objectivity. Through the method of psychoanalysis and the phenomenon of transference, Freud and those who followed could describe the sources, range, variety, transformations, derivatives, perversions, and sublimations of love. But all this knowledge and theory construction was based on psychoanalytic observation of the patient. Very little was said about the analyst's reciprocal love for the patient. In contrast to the volumes written about love and sexuality in the patient, there has been, with a few notable exceptions, very little discussion of the analyst's love for the patient. Some of the reasons for this relative neglect can be construed as conceptual, ethical, and practical. As a concept, Freud's theory of human sexuality was a major achievement. From early on, philosophers have differentiated types of love: parental, filial, affectionate, erotic, altruistic, sexual, and so forth. But it is Freud's contribution to have created a unified theory in which all these adult varieties may be seen as derivatives or sublimations of infantile sexuality. With a unified libido theory, however, any loving feelings on the part of a therapist are viewed as watered down or aim-inhibited forms of sexuality, and therefore as carrying the potential for acting out their original aims. This conceptual view of sexuality added weight to the ethical concerns that love experienced and expressed by the analyst would lead to action. The analyst's reciprocal response was understood to be as unreal as the patient's, cast as the analyst's transference to the patient, a countertransference, to be kept out of the analysis and mastered through self-analysis or a return to personal treatment. In one of the early important papers on countertransference, Lucia Tower sums up the view then prevailing. Quotes, virtually every writer on the subject of countertransference states unequivocally that no form of erotic reaction to a patient is to be tolerated. She infers from this vehemence, however, that erotic responses to some extent trouble nearly every analyst. Freud's idea of transference and countertransference provided clinicians with a theory and technical tools to withstand the temptations inherent in all situations of power and authority. The story of the origin of psychoanalysis, as reported by Freud and codified by Ernest Jones, is that Joseph Breuer, Freud's senior, had the discovery of the new science of psychoanalysis in his grasp, but taking his patient's declarations of love as real, terminated the treatment in panic and promptly impregnated his wife. The younger Freud understood that Anna O's love for Breuer was a transference of her infantile wish for a baby from her father, and that the good Dr. Breuer should have been neither flattered nor frightened by his patient's passionate declarations. Recent historical research into records of the hospital where Anna O was seen and into the birth records of Breuer's children indicates that this story is inaccurate. Indeed, it seems to be less history and more a myth of origin, a construction that carries all the powerful ego ideals and standards of a nation, religion, or discipline. This myth of the origin of psychoanalysis serves to reinforce the theoretical, ethical, and practical constraints on analyst countertransference. In the main, these constraints have, for the past 100 years, proved effective for the majority of analysts in dealing with impulses and with patients. But times have changed, and so has the world. Freud emerged from and hastened the passing of a Victorian culture in which people were eager to fall in love, but afraid to fall in sex. And we are now, as Rollo May once put it, eager to fall in sex, but afraid to fall in love. We are in a post-Freudian era in which a watered-down, facile, one-sided version of the Freudian revolution has prevailed. Lifting repression was originally considered a means to an end. But our culture has emphasized the facile letting loose of id impulses rather than the hard work of enlarging the ego's capacity to contain, transform, and master primitive affects and impulses. Along with these social changes, incorporating elements of psychoanalytic thought in the prevailing culture, have come changes in psychoanalysis. In particular, the theory of countertransference has changed. Now, every reaction and feeling the analyst has is considered countertransference, which is regarded by many as the fulcrum of therapeutic change. Due largely to the influence of Kleinian theories of projective identification, a blurring of the many sources and varieties of feelings therapists can have for patients has occurred. In 1949, Winnicott wrote about hate in the countertransference. In that article, he differentiated between objective and subjective hate and love. Lowald, one of the few classical American analysts to address these issues, wrote in 1957 that the analyst makes himself available for the development of a new object relationship, and that to do this requires an objectivity and neutrality, to the essence of which is love and respect for the individual and for the individual development. This love and respect represents the counterpart in reality, in interaction with which the organization and reorganization of ego and psychic apparatus takes place. Now that we no longer have the limit setting of the original Freudian idea of countertransference, how are we to differentiate between the analyst's objective and subjective love, and to determine the usefulness or harm of either in the therapeutic process? We recognize that Winnicott's and Lowell's terminology, objective, objectivity, reality, can be criticized, as Barrett said, unreflectively positivistic, naively realist, even tacitly pre-Kantian. But the role of reality in much of psychoanalytic theory is a continuing problem. It is beyond the scope of this paper to discuss the philosophical dimensions. But we may at least note here the complexities in elucidating levels and kinds of reality in the psychoanalytic situation, and the history of the various ways the idea of psychic reality has been understood. We feel comfortable with what Charles Handley terms critical realism, that is, the epistemology of common sense, science, and psychoanalysis. Neither a single-track theory, which may ignore the mutual influences of endowment and environmental factors, nor a purely intrapsychic model of motivation and cause takes adequate account of the interaction of reality and the internal life of the body and mind. We have pointed out that Freud explicitly delineates an original reality ego that precedes the purified pleasure ego. Levin has made a cogent critique of developmental theories that exclude the role of reality and ignore its primacy in Freud's theory. We are concerned that the rediscovery of the analyst's irreducible subjectivity leaves the patient prey to unsubstantiated, intrusive interpretations based on the analyst's countertransference, with the accompanying danger of denial of reality.
For 30 years, we've been working to revise the commonly held Greensonian conceptualization of the Therapeutic Alliance. At the outset, we noted that our formulation of the alliance included motives from transference and non-transference sources, rational and irrational elements, positive and negative goals. We distinguished between the capacities available to most people to form an alliance and motivations to form and maintain one. The latter vary widely and are subject to the influence of many factors. In a series of papers, we have also demonstrated the utility of conceptualizing treatment in terms of phases, as first suggested by Glover. Our revised theory of the Therapeutic Alliance is operationalized in terms of specific tasks for each person in the therapeutic relationship: therapist, patient, and parents or significant others. All the Therapeutic Alliance tasks persist throughout treatment, but specific tasks come to the forefront in each phase. This formulation of the Therapeutic Alliance has proved useful as a lens for highlighting certain features of a therapeutic relationship and some pervasive aspects of pathology, particularly sadomasochistic omnipotent resistances and relationships in treatment. As our ideas about the development and treatment of sadomasochism have evolved, we have developed a view of omnipotence that departs from the classical description. In our 1972 study on beating fantasies in children, we found it useful to distinguish among wishes, thoughts, and fantasies. Drawing on Schaeffer's work, we restricted our use of the term fantasy to refer to conscious daydreams. Omnipotence is a quality that can accompany wishes, thoughts, and daydreams. As such, it can be a harmlessly pleasurable element of play or creativity, as long as awareness of the distinction between real and pretend, between thought and action is maintained. There can be an illusion of omnipotence accompanying childhood fantasies, including the transitory beating fantasies we found in girls during the Oedipal phase. When, however, fantasies of this sort are validated by external factors, such as serious medical conditions, death or other accidents of fate, or psychological trauma stemming from parental inadequacy or pathology, an illusion of omnipotence can be converted into a delusion. In our work, we have emphasized that we do not view omnipotent beliefs as part of normal development, or as equivalent to oceanic feelings, grandiosity, egocentrism, or primary narcissism. Omnipotent beliefs are created in response to reality failures in order to protect the person from physical or psychological trauma. We define omnipotence as a conscious or unconscious belief in the power to control others, to hurt them, to force them to submit to one's desires, and probably, ultimately, to force the mother to be a good enough, competent, protective, and loving parent. An omnipotent response to helplessness is a possibility at any time for anyone, including the therapist. This conceptualization of omnipotence is consistent with recent developmental and biological research and relates to the empirically tested psychoanalytic views of Weiss on pathological beliefs. Omnipotent guilt is one of the main subscales in his measure of interpersonal guilt and figures centrally in his psychoanalytic study of patients with bondage and beating fantasies. These characteristics of omnipotence imply a separate pathway of pathological development, in contrast to a normal system of self-regulation based on an economy of pleasure from competence at each level of development. The therapeutic relationship contains the possibility both of healthy, competent ways of relating and of pathologically omnipotent sadomasochistic patterns. This means that there is a potential either for growth-promoting, mutually enhancing forms of love in the treatment, or for perverse sadomasochistic loving arising between patient and therapist. Patients bring the potential for both modes of conflict resolution into the treatment. So does the analyst. In earlier papers, we have discussed the therapeutic alliance as a major relational concept that provides a particular vantage point on the therapeutic relationship. Just as we have found the alliance a crucial aid in examining the vicissitudes of hostile, aggressive, sexualized power relationships in treatment, so it ought to shed equal light on aspects of the therapeutic relationship that are mutually respectful, growth-enhancing, and loving, and reveal criteria for differentiating the two kinds of relationship. We have focused in earlier work on the interaction of therapeutic alliance tasks and sadomasochistic omnipotent resistances in the patient and in parents. This paper is a beginning attempt to create a theoretical space for exploring the role of the analyst's love in the psychoanalytic process. We will not be saying anything new about love itself. There are volumes of writing about love, notably Bergman's scholarly psychoanalytic exposition of the history of the human quest for the meaning of love, or Singer's 2-volume critical philosophical analysis of love from antiquity to modern times. Here we are going to look at the therapist's love for the patient at each phase of treatment in relation to the Therapeutic Alliance tasks for each phase. We will use the distinction between the open, competent, and closed omnipotent systems of self-regulation to provide criteria for distinguishing between positive and negative effects of the therapist's love. With this focus, bear in mind that we are not attempting to address all aspects of each phase, or the complexity of the whole relationship between therapist and patient. Rather, we are concentrating on varieties of love that therapists experience toward their patients.
Start with the evaluation phase. Let us start with a brief description of a clinical problem arising during the evaluation phase. A pretty, friendly, and bright young woman recently came to see me for a first appointment. Miss Q talked about friends who would do absolutely anything for her, yet she felt she couldn't talk to them. She couldn't be more specific about her unhappiness and left me somewhat nonplussed. My feelings were compounded when she described a healthy, uneventful childhood and pleasant relationships with parents and siblings. What did I have to work with? I was disposed to like Miss Q on the basis of her superficial presentation, but felt stymied and baffled by her dumping her ill-defined problem in my lap. My skills didn't feel relevant or available. Well, let's keep this problem in mind as we discuss issues of love in the Therapeutic Alliance during the evaluation phase of treatment, to see whether and how our ideas can help us make sense of this experience. The major focus of assessment is the kind of relationship that is initiated in the interaction from the very start, even in the first phone conversation. Here, the distinction between love as part of the open system and love embedded in a closed sadomasochistic system is important. What will it mean for the nature of the therapeutic relationship if the patient tells the therapist what wonderful recommendations led to the call, or that the referrer is an eminent colleague? Suppose the patient is a prominent person in the community, or very beautiful, or highly accomplished, or famous. Here is the potential for the opposing dynamics of envy and admiration, idealization or respect, seduction or attachment. These competing sets of feelings enter into the pressure the patient exerts on the relationship and into the reactions of the therapist brings to it. Envy, idealization, and seduction all involve inequalities of power, have hostile intent, and presage the formation of sadomasochistic patterns of interaction. Defenses of externalization and projection figure prominently in the formation and maintenance of such patterns. In contrast, respect, attachment, and admiration involve positive feelings and non-defensive ego functions and relate to competence in both parties. Two systems of self-esteem regulation are potentially available to both patient and therapist. Awareness of the characteristics of love in the two systems may alert the therapist to useful or potentially interfering feelings. In a series of studies on sexual feelings in psychotherapy, Pope and his colleagues have found that male therapists reported being attracted to female patients who met some standard of physical beauty. Female therapists were sexually attracted to male patients who met external criteria of success, such as wealth, good background, or accomplishment. These are all external attributes visible immediately to the therapist at evaluation. Attraction on these bases is like love at first sight, which represents a fantasy of conquest, possession, or rescue, rather than respect, admiration, and curiosity about the place of these attributes in the patient's overall personality. The patient comes in a state of need, looking for an authoritative person to relieve distress. The underlying transference may be to a powerful, omniscient parental figure. This can set up a conflict between the wish for and fear of dependent submission. There is an immediate imbalance in the power relationship, part of which is real and necessary, and part of which is the patient's transference. The patient really needs someone competent, who knows what can help, but there can be a confusion in both people between authoritative competence and authoritarian dominance. Therapists may collude with the patient's fantasy wish and make intrusive formulations for which there is no shared database, thereby setting up from the very beginning a situation of therapeutic compliance. Alternatively, they may bend over backward to avoid this danger and thus be so tentative and passive that the patient has no feeling of safety. So what then is the place of love in the evaluation phase? In a realistic open system of personality function, love grows slowly out of experience of the other and of oneself with the other. The transformations started in the evaluation phase take time to develop properly. The period of evaluation can promote confidence and hope in both patient and therapist that treatment will be useful for this patient, a sense that the therapist's experience and skill can join with the patient's capacities to produce change. The therapist's satisfaction in the exercise of competence fuels the capacity to respect the patient and lays the groundwork for developing a regard for the whole person of the other. If there is no evaluation, treatment starts on the basis of separate motivations, each person functioning alone. A therapist with a general feeling about people and about his or her skills meets a patient who is looking for anybody. This can set up magical expectations that force the patient back into a solipsistic universe or keep the patient there rather than fostering realistic confidence in a joint effort. The result of the transformations of the evaluation phase is a shift from separately held beliefs to the beginning of shared, reality-based respect and conviction about this particular partnership. This joint confidence will be repeatedly assailed throughout treatment. Hence its importance for the maintenance of the therapist's conviction in the face of inevitable undermining from the transference of the patient's pathology during treatment. Thus, the evaluation can provide the building blocks in the form of respect, hope, and a sense of potential partnership for the therapist's objective love for the patient, to use Winnicott's term. How does this apply to the problem situation described earlier? Let's go back to Miss Q and my frustration in the middle of her first evaluation session with me. My sense that the hour was surprisingly long signaled me that a potential dynamic was being set up. She would be the miserable one and would get me to be the one with the magical, omnipotent knowledge to fix things. My discomfort at our being cast in these roles spurred me to consider an alternative approach, one that would move us toward the possibility of a more open interaction. I asked her when in her life she had felt wonderful. Miss Q gave me a puzzled look, shrugged, and answered, with success. When I asked for specific instances, she perked up and told me with a shining face all about a serious athletic pursuit in her adolescence, when she had excelled and won many competitions. Her face fell, however, when she said, but then there were the bad times when I didn't win, and they canceled out the good ones. I perked up inside at that and remarked on what an interesting paradigm she had just described. It would be important for us to look at how it worked. If the bad times canceled out the good ones, she was left with nothing. The rest of the session passed quickly as we talked more about her indeterminate feelings of unhappiness, possibly relating to a difficulty in holding and accumulating good feelings inside. We had begun together to see the outlines of an internal conflict over pleasure, and I began to feel that there was a possibility of enlisting her ego with mine to understand. For me as the therapist, this feeling of potentially effective functioning was a crucial first step toward valuing the relationship specific to this person.
The beginning phase. Two clinical cases may serve to illustrate issues arising during the beginning phase. Case 1. A brilliant, accomplished, middle-aged man had spent many years in psychotherapy with another clinician, but came to me for consultation when old symptoms recurred. Mr. G felt he had been trapped in the earlier treatment and that no movement had taken place for years. Although the work they had done on his early relationship with a very disturbed mother had been useful to him, he was terrified of resuming any therapy, as he had found his deep regression overwhelming and feared the unbearable pain of inevitable separations. During the evaluation, he reacted with intense feeling to even minor interventions and had found it almost impossible to take anything in when he began to feel too much. When treatment began, Mr. G talked a lot, jumping from subject to subject. Sometimes he told me not to speak because he could not listen. A controlling atmosphere created by the threat of his extreme emotions began to set in. The therapist alternated between being annoyed and worrying that the patient might be more disturbed than he had initially appeared. Case 2. A mental health professional came for treatment a number of years after completion of his first analysis with complaints of somatic anxieties, restlessness, and general dissatisfaction with his life and work. Mr. X began a second analysis and very soon brought complaints about all our mutual colleagues and how different and better I was than his first analyst. I thought that the analysis was progressing well enough until I noticed that I was looking forward to his sessions, somewhat eager, even excited to see him. This patient was actually Jack's patient, which will become clear in a moment. Soon after, the patient began to report fantasies of what he called a homosexual relationship with the therapist. Mr. X said fantasies of this sort had first emerged in his previous treatment. He and his male analyst had understood his thoughts of sexually satisfying his analyst as a defense against competitive feelings and wishes to defeat his male rival. How could the analyst best understand what was happening in the treatment at that point? Let's keep these vignettes in mind as we discuss how attention in the beginning phase to therapeutic alliance tasks and the two potential systems of self-regulation can illuminate the relationship and the feelings of both participants. In the beginning phase, the patient's therapeutic alliance task is to be with the therapist. Parents or significant others have the task of allowing the patient to be with another, and the therapist strives to feel with the patient. The therapist intervenes actively when obstacles to being together arise from within the patient, from the environment, or from the therapist. These tasks of being with and feeling with will persist throughout treatment, but predominate at the beginning. The model for this attunement is the early mother-child relationship. Fluctuations in attunement may draw on and relate to issues of mother-child attachment during infancy and toddlerhood. Disruptions and deviations in being with are our first indicators of resistance to engaging in the therapeutic process and direct our attention to describing the conditions under which the patient can be with the therapist. Typical disruptions take familiar forms, as when patients externalize their helplessness, confusion, or failure. Not so easy to spot, but part of the same closed sadomasochistic way of relating are externalizations of positive ego functions or idealized images of self or other. These can mark periods of heady gratification in the treatment, when therapists feel terrific and may in turn idealize their patients. Instead of experiencing the sense of reality-attuned gratification that comes from doing a good enough job in a difficult and frequently frustrating line of work, the therapist begins to feel like a long-sought, perfect parent, friend, or lover. The therapist may begin to daydream about the patient, miss the patient, dress especially for the patient, indeed has fallen in love with the patient. Externalization is a major mechanism in sadomasochistic relationships, and its operation in the conditions set up by the patient in the treatment relationship is often signaled by the quality of the analyst's love. Being with and feeling with are such all-encompassing fundamental concepts that it may seem unnecessary to set them explicitly as alliance tasks. Indeed, how can there be any therapy at all if the patient cannot be with the therapist? Less obvious, but still axiomatic, is the therapist's task of feeling with the patient. Yet these seemingly self-evident propositions are seldom examined. When they are, we are often left with words such as empathy or projective identification, which do more to mystify technique than to clarify it. The beginning phase is seldom talked about. The classical focus on the centrality of insight, coupled with the discarding of the concept of the therapeutic alliance, has left no room for the relationship as the foundation for any subsequent cognitive affective focus. Analysts seem to have forgotten Freud's early injunction to interpret only after the establishment of a positive relationship. The theoretical vacuum thereby created has led to the popularity of theories that emphasize the relationship. Our focus on love in this paper allows us to examine some pitfalls of such theories. A major problem is the confusion for the therapist between being the recipient of objective or realistic love and the powerfully seductive experience of being the object of the patient's idealization, passion, and dependence. Or as we would put it, being the object of the patient's fantasy of sadomasochistic omnipotent enthrallment. Locked in mutual enactment of a sadomasochistic relationship, such a therapy never moves beyond an endless beginning phase of being with and feeling with. The patient is seen only as traumatized, dependent, and in need of reparative love. The therapist is cast in and revels in the role of the perfect mother who, through the power of love and sacrifice, can cure all. Alternatively, the roles can be reversed, and the therapist can be the helpless, bewildered one, while the patient controls the interaction through hostile externalizations of inadequacies. These are the treatments doomed to end prematurely or to persist for years unfruitfully, leaving both people unsatisfied. We use the concept of the two systems of self-regulation and the lens of the therapeutic alliance tasks to help us see what we are looking for, to set explicit goals against which we may measure our own fluctuations and those of the patient. Conceptualizing in this way, a therapist may find it easier to feel with the patient's wishes, anxieties, and conflicts around being with another. When the therapist verbalizes some of the obstacles to being with, the patient can at times feel enormous relief and the intense adaptive gratification of communicating and being listened to. These feelings are both a major goal and a result of the beginning phase, and the experience becomes a powerful motive in a positive way for the therapeutic alliance. It is not something brought to treatment by the patient, nor is it supplied by an omnipotent therapist. Indeed, omnipotent externalization and attunement are inversely related. Attunement is created by both patient and therapist out of the effort to note together the difficulties in the alliance task of being with the therapist, whether the obstacles come from within the patient, from the environment, or from the therapist. The experience of attunement, which taps into and reverberates with powerful feelings from our earliest relationships, is a genuine source of positive feelings. We allocate this experience to open system functioning. Reality-based love between individuals grows out of sharing the satisfaction of these ego needs. The moments of attunement that result from the work of the beginning phase are the building blocks of objective love between therapist and patient. Let us now look at how these ideas can aid our understanding of the growing relationship in the treatments of Mr. G and Mr. X. Mr. G's emotional controlling created a barrier to progress and a pressure for a relationship ruled by intense, primitive affects. If I felt with him solely on the level that Mr. G sought to be on with me, there would be a connection between us, but one based only on shared pain, which would reenact his traumatic, undifferentiated relationship with his mother that had been repeated in the earlier treatment. If I retreated from contact with Mr. G's deep feelings, there was a risk of treatment failure through lack of imagination and affective resonance. I sought assistance by invoking internally the idea of the therapeutic alliance task as including feeling with the whole person of the patient, carrying the knowledge and perception of Mr. G's capacities at many different levels. The potential to react with hostility or vindictive withdrawal from Mr. G's controlling presentation of only one level of his personality was contained by my holding on to the progressive goal of relating to Mr. G as a separate person with many different feelings and skills. Mr. G responded to the steadiness of my regard with a gradual expansion of his emotional range and repertoire, as he found new ways to be with me and participate in the work of the treatment. Jack had many reasons to feel good about Mr. X's treatment. He was a successful, valued member of the mental health community. They seemed to be working well together, the material was deepening, and a clear movement might be discerned from displaced rivalry to homosexual defense. Interpretation would allow for the emergence of the Oedipal rivalry with the analyst in the Transference. However, this had been the process in his previous analysis and had been worked on quite extensively, so why the repetition? Even more important, the analyst realized that his feeling for the patient was based not on ego satisfaction leading to objective respect and love, but rather on id gratification in which the patient exploited the analyst's own omnipotent wish for an easy victory. In the patient's eyes, the analyst was the best, the most brilliant, and the most desired, defeating not only male rivals, but also his attractive wife. The analyst and patient probably could have remained in this closed, omnipotent system forever. The analyst's awareness that this was excited sadomasochistic interaction and not objective love made him ask the question of himself and then ask the patient why he felt he had to go to such lengths to get the analyst's love and attention. The material then shifted and remained for a long time in the area of his relationship with a beautiful, self-absorbed mother who used him as her audience. The analyst's feelings also changed noticeably. No longer excited, he felt the pleasant satisfaction of doing good enough work. This patient's sessions were often painful, sometimes emptied by his defensive efforts, but both seemed to feel that neither had to put on a show. They no longer felt compelled to do something for the other, to magically compensate for the patient's mother's depression or make up for his early deprivation. Through this phase of being with and feeling with, the patient increasingly focused on his own needs, his own mind, and the choice between omnipotent control of his analyst and finding satisfaction from mastery of his own life.
The middle phase. Mr. X, the patient we've just talked about, who had flattered me with idealized comparisons, was in his third year of treatment. Much of the recent material centered on the illusory lure of his omnipotent conviction that he could control others, especially women, by overwhelming them with his sexual prowess. A particularly fruitful period of work led to a powerful insight into a dream. This helped to resolve a difficulty he was having with a female patient of his own. Mr. X felt good about his capacity to think this through instead of pulling a magical therapeutic intervention out of a hat. He and I were both very pleased and proud in the session in which we accomplished this piece of joint work. And then for the next 2 weeks he was withdrawn and depressed, fell asleep in his sessions, and seemed unable to recover. The middle phase of treatment is usually the longest. It is probably also the most discussed in theoretical, clinical, and technical writings. The phase is marked by the patient's growing curiosity about his or her mind. Indeed, the mind and how it functions becomes an object of therapeutic investigation. Earlier, we noted how the currently fashionable exclusive focus on the relationship risks keeping the patient at the beginning phase of treatment. Equally problematic, however, is an exclusive emphasis on the close process analysis of ego functions. The concept of the therapeutic alliance, we believe, allows for the inclusion of both these aspects in the context of looking at how a patient and therapist accomplish the middle phase task of the alliance. In this phase, the task for the patient is working together with the therapist. For the therapist, the task involves the maximum use of ego functions in the work. The central task of the beginning phase related to early mother-child affects of attunement. In the middle phase, with its major emphasis on the task of working together, can be related to developmental issues of the early school years, the period called latency. Freud described analysis as providing a playground wherein the transference can be allowed to expand in complete freedom. Play is a basic developmental task of the latency period. In our developmental studies of sadomasochism, we found that the childhoods of such adults and the therapy sessions of such children were marked by an inability to play. In order to play, the child must be able to distinguish between real and pretend, to engage in the freedom and boundlessness of pretend. The child must be secured in rules, limits, and the existence of others. As the eminent Dutch historian Jan Huizinga said, play illustrates the profound truth that freedom exists by means of restraints. Just as play is possible only within the confines of mutually accepted rules, so sexuality can be safely explored in latency only within the boundaries of distinctions between thought and action, and between generations. Neil Postman has written that American culture is hostile to childhood, that the line between childhood and adulthood is eroding, and that the idea of childhood, which first arose in the Renaissance, is disappearing rapidly. Whether or not this is universally true, we do see evidence of these tendencies in many of our patients. Many adults we treat were not only exposed as children to the adult world of sex and violence, but were also expected to assume responsibilities beyond their capacities. For adults, the middle phase can be an opportunity to rework latency tasks, a time when they can play, and so safely explore their thoughts, feelings, and desires. To provide such a setting, we as therapists have to be absolutely clear about the boundaries, while being free to explore our own inner worlds, including our reactions of love and sexuality. Working together with a competent exercise of ego functions provides an experience of good mental functioning, satisfies deep ego needs for both patient and analyst, and draws on the accumulated transformations of earlier experiences of attunement. It motivates further work and aids the internalization of collaboration. This internalization allows for internal dialogue and exploration in patient and therapist, and nourishes creativity with its accompanying feelings of joy. Part of working together is acknowledgement of this pleasure. If the patient or the therapist does not feel this joy or cannot share it, this failure signals inhibition of ego functioning and can be used as the entry point for exploring underlying conflicts around feeling good. This is the time in treatment when patients begin to love their therapist in a fuller way, as trust has been established, and when familiarity allows for a deepening of understanding and the faster repair of misunderstandings. It is from the joint work that the patient gains an ever more pleasurable experience of good functioning. The therapist, too, appreciates the pleasure of functioning at peak efficiency and values the person with whom that can be done. The sense of each as a separate person is integral to developing objective or realistic love for the other. Friedman was one of the first to criticize the contradictions in the Sturba-Greenson formulation of the Therapeutic Alliance, with its sharp distinction between the transference and the real relationship. He also came to the thought-provoking conclusion that the idea of the alliance serves the analyst more than it does the patient. The difficulty of analytic work, he says, may create a hunger for cooperation. Friedman was concerned that the alliance concept might rationalize the imposition on the patient of the analyst's needs for reassurance and companionship. This may be one of the sources of the conflict analysts can feel about their love for their patients. In our view, however, there is nothing intrinsically wrong with a concept that helps the analyst. We all need a framework for encompassing as much of our experience as possible. Thus, we characterize the therapeutic alliance as meeting the analyst's needs in a positive sense, with the implication that each treatment will be a developmental experience for the analyst as well as for the patient. However, with the current erosion of fundamental psychoanalytic strictures, Friedman's view should be taken as a useful injunction to examine whether a technical innovation serves only the analyst or does in fact benefit the patient. Here we are trying not only to create a theoretical and technical space for what we have called objective love, but also to emphasize the ongoing need to distinguish between omnipotent power relations as part of a closed system of functioning, disguised as love, and the growth-enhancing love that we allocate to open system functioning. The contrast between pleasure in competent functioning and the illusory gains of omnipotent fantasy gratification becomes a powerful perception that relates to the difference between self-esteem regulation based on realistic, progressive achievements and skills, and self-esteem based on an economy of pain and aggression. Working together in the treatment relationship is a new source of pleasure in competence and provides a base for the elaboration of realistic capacities that replaces old pathological methods of narcissistic supply. But what about the therapist? During the middle phase, the therapist too may experience a conflict between the two systems, between the rush of omnipotent gratification and the less intense but more genuine and sustained good feelings of reality-based love for the patient and for oneself in relation to the patient. It is in connection with the middle phase pleasures of working together that we find new relevance in our idea of two systems of self-regulation and can begin to evolve criteria to differentiate love that is exploitative and love that is beneficial. To address this difference, let us briefly explore issues of play, love, and sexuality in the context of the middle phase of working together. Earlier we noted the shifts from the Victorian preoccupation with love, first to the equation of sex and love, and then to the current notion of sex being characterized by the frequency, intensity, and quality of orgasm, with an accompanying assumption that violence and sadism are integral to sexuality. This is one root of the difficulty in even talking about love in the therapeutic setting. It is considered the same as sex. But when the discussion is really about sex, almost all therapists would agree with Freud's last words on the subject. Quotes, real sexual relations between patients and analysts are out of the question. Survey research cited by Pope and others indicates that 5 to 17% of mental health professionals admit to sexual intimacies with their clients. However, the same survey reveals that almost all male therapists, 95%, and over 3/4 of female therapists, 76%, admit to having been sexually attracted to their clients. A majority reported feeling guilty, anxious, or confused by the sexual attraction. If all love is basically sex, and if sexual attraction is such a widespread feeling, what help can we offer? In his posthumous outline of psychoanalysis, Freud presented a theory of eros that differs profoundly from his original theory of sexuality. In this radical modification, he designated one of the two basic instincts as eros, whose aim is to bind together, to establish greater unities, and to preserve them. Freud called the energy of eros libido, stressing that this should not be equated with sexuality alone, as is so often done even today. He says the greater part of what we know about eros has been gained from a study of the sexual function, which indeed, in the prevailing view, even if not according to our theory, coincides with eros. So in Freud's revised theory, sex is but one part of eros, a view compatible with the understanding of love and sex that arises out of considering clinical phenomena in the light of our concept of two systems of self-regulation. When we think in terms of one system open to reality that uses inner and outer resources for creativity and mastery, and another system closed and operating according to sadomasochistic, omnipotent delusions of hostile control, then eros can be viewed as an overarching definer of the open system, in which pleasure and self-esteem are based on competent, respectful, creative interactions with reality. Sex is an impulse to action and it occurs as part of an open system only when subsumed by eros or love. In an open system, sexuality is part of the overriding aim of eros, to unite, enhance, and create greater unities. So love, both in Freud's last theory and in our conception, is part of an open system of self-regulation that includes more than sex alone. Sex can also be part of a closed system, where disguised as love, it aims to exert hostile control and dominance over the other. Most psychoanalytic authors, in strict accord with Freud's earlier sexual theory, do not differentiate between sex driven by hostile omnipotent aims and sex contained in and expressing the overarching aim of eros or love. Sexual feelings that occur in the context of a wish to love, share, enhance, and create. Sex that is part of respect, caring, the giving and receiving of pleasure. Such is the sexuality we see as part of an open system of reality-attuned pleasure. Failure to distinguish sex of this sort from sex derived from intense needs to exert power and dominance over others. In other words, failure to see the contrast between two different systems of self-regulation and functioning adds to difficulties in helping both patients and therapists sort out destructive from helpful feelings of love and sexuality. When we contrast love in the open and closed systems of self-regulation, we are not delineating a dichotomy between realistic and transference love. There is transference in both systems. Just as we use the alliance as a lens to highlight the capacities and motivations for being with and working together with another, so transference is a lens that may be applied to the very same material to highlight the sources, history, and transformations of feelings and relationships. Both these lenses, among the many provided by psychoanalytic theory, helps us to see more clearly the phenomena in each system. Sexual fantasies in therapists may be frequent, but we believe on the basis of personal experience, therapeutic and supervisory work with mental health professionals, and published and unpublished accounts of such fantasies, that they often arise as a sadomasochistic reaction to real or imagined helplessness. Therapists use these fantasies as defenses against rage, boredom, loss of boundaries, anxiety, fear of failure, externalizations, and so forth. Such fantasies have the effect of denying the uniqueness of a particular therapeutic relationship, and they operate to defend against realistic or objective love. When the analyst recognizes the hostile, omnipotent nature of the sexual fantasies, they can serve as a signal for the therapist to consider where they are coming from. Is an undetected sadomasochistic pattern of interaction creeping into the therapeutic relationship? Sex between patient and therapist would constitute an exploitative, hostile action on the part of both. In the closed omnipotent system, sex is used to create the illusion that only one person can release the passion. The pursuit of the object of sexual passion is felt to be worth the destruction of all ties and obligations. The therapist who is functioning within the open system experiences pleasure in the therapeutic process, but does not feel dependent on any particular patient for the joy of creative work together. Mr. X's withdrawal had followed our satisfying work together. I was aware that the advance would probably arouse conflict in Mr. X, but I became increasingly plagued by doubt. I was troubled by the possibility that my pleasure in our joint work might have been too stimulating. Had I been sexually seductive? Was I exploiting him, hoping he would idealize me as he had done at the beginning of treatment? My uncertainty was a symptom of the impasse, though it was hard to understand that at first. Mr. X seemed unable to make eye contact when he came into the sessions. With a mixture of remorse and terror, he told me that after that session he had felt pleased with himself and proud of our work together. He felt that he loved me and that I loved him. Then he said he didn't know what happened. As he had listened to his next patient, he found himself distracted with sexual fantasies and thoughts of having sex with her. He was frightened that he would lose control and even thought of masturbating during the session. He had felt utterly strange, dissociated, and was filled with remorse and fear. He felt that I should report him and have him disqualified. He then wanted to kill all feelings in himself. He felt wicked, an uncontrolled pervert. Mr. X remembered being asked to rub his mother's naked back when he was a child. He used to feel giddy, strange, and overwhelmed by excitement. As an adolescent, he had masturbated with fantasies of losing control and ejaculating all over a woman's face. It seemed that his helpless rage at his mother for sexually overwhelming and using him had overtaken his loving feelings. His omnipotent reaction was a fantasy of attacking his mother with his uncontrolled sexuality. As we talked about his helplessness and rage of this emotionally abusive parent, Mr. X returned to describe our sessions of mutually respectful pleasure and love as occurring within and because of the safety of the rules and boundaries that were always honored in his treatment with me. He felt that it was a new experience to be treated as a separate, autonomous individual, appreciated realistically for his good qualities, and not because of his omnipotent manipulation. But it made a sharp and painful contrast to his experience with his mother and his previous analyst, and this enraged him. It made him want to return to where boundaries, rules, and reality limits did not apply. He wanted revenge. Mr. X talked about the good session as mutative play, but he felt that in his rage he didn't want to play anymore, like a child who tips over the chessboard when he is losing. To stay with me in the world of reality-attuned pleasures and limitations would mean finally putting aside his omnipotent conviction that he could eventually force his mother to love him as the child he really was then. But what of my part in all this? Why did I lose my sense of the ego capacities and motivations each of us had brought to the work, doubt my feelings and experience, and turn to an omnipotent belief that I had somehow sexually overwhelmed Mr. X? In retrospect, I would say that I had responded to his self-destructive omnipotent rage first with helplessness, and then with an equally omnipotent counter-reactive belief that my words and demeanor were so powerful as to overwhelm him. This would imply that he was weak and helpless, like a child who had no resources other than to dissociate. My wish to apologize and make amends was in fact a hostile, demeaning thought disguised as a concern and love for the patient. In response to his hostile destruction of our joint work, I had lost my objective love, my respect for his capacities, and my sense of him as a complex whole adult, and not just a helpless, overstimulated, and traumatized child. When I regained perspective, I could point out to him not only his shame, but also his omnipotent conviction that what he had done or felt was overwhelmingly destructive. In response to my restored objective love, he could detail the sequence described above, and could acknowledge his wish to leave the world of realistic limits and real love, so that he could wreak his revenge on his mother.
The pre-termination phase. Ms. D had been a very troubled young woman, but had used her long treatment and excellent capacities to make her way effectively in the world. Increasingly in sessions, she was beginning to enjoy her mind, following her thoughts, valuing herself, and feeling valued for her own way of thinking. As her personal and professional lives took off, she and I both began to think about termination. As Ms. D imagined the possibilities termination would open up, she could relocate and further her professional development, she became increasingly anxious. She had no appetite and began to lose weight rapidly. She made mistakes at work and whined or slept in sessions. Her boyfriend broke up with her in exasperation, and she took to her bed, emerging only to come to sessions and to go to work frequently enough to avoid being fired. Ms. D appeared to be having a catastrophic reaction to the prospect of finishing her treatment. She roused herself to complain about the ineffectiveness of her analysis, wondering if she should switch to a different form of therapy, take medication, or just stop altogether. This was a trying time. It was hard not to be infected with her doubts and negativity. In an earlier publication, we wrote that this phase of treatment, pre-termination, is seldom discussed or delineated, but recent intensive study of termination has made it clear that there is a distinct set of tasks to be addressed before a termination phase can be started. The task for the patient is to maintain progressive momentum, to take increasing responsibility for the joint work, and to translate insights into effective actions. Each of these tasks can trigger resistances to forward development. We pointed out the need to be explicit with the patient about the crucial opportunity in treatment to say goodbye to someone while loving and feeling loved in return. An opportunity to detach separation from loss of love, anger, or rejection. In the case we reported there, Mr. T shouted, "I'd rather be mad than sad." During the pre-termination phase, we looked together at the quality and constancy of the patient's regard for the therapist. This has been implicit in the quality of being together and working together, but must be recognized explicitly in relation to the patient's willingness to love and be loved in a mutually enhancing, respectful way. Saying goodbye to someone valued in this mature way is sad, but not devastating. It's painful, but the pain is offset by good memories. The experience of mourning leads to growth. In contrast, saying goodbye in the context of an abusive, exploitative relationship carries no sadness, but perpetuates trauma and leaves the individual depleted, furious, and searching for revenge by any means. Hence the importance of feeling secure at pre-termination about the achievements of the middle phase. In the course of therapy, important ego needs have been recognized and met through the Therapeutic Alliance. The needs to be felt with, listened to, understood, validated, and admired for progressive achievements are basic to everyone. Where does the therapist's love for the patient belong during the pre-termination phase? The therapist's principal alliance tasks in this phase are to relinquish initiative without withdrawal and to allow for and acknowledge the patient's increasingly effective autonomous functioning. without being overwhelmed by feelings of abandonment, loss, or defeat. The therapist has to be able to relinquish the extremely satisfying experience of providing understanding through competent use of his or her ego, while still feeling important to the patient. This is a juncture at which the therapist again becomes aware of the importance of autonomous sources of self-esteem, as dependence on the patient's neediness will cripple both therapeutic partners and bring the treatment to a standstill, expressed either in premature termination or a prolonged unproductive therapy. Only in the context of love and respect for the patient as a separate person can the therapist hand over initiative and responsibility. Awareness of the distinction between the two systems of self-regulation allows the therapist to feel objective love, love of the real skills of self and other used separately and together, love of the work accomplished, and love for the unique, capable person the patient has become. Only with security and objective love can the therapist experience and use an objective hatred of the patient's desperate attempts to fall back on omnipotent manipulation to destroy the therapeutic achievement and the competent skills of both partners. I felt increasingly worried about Ms. D. As her regression deepened and persisted, I was assailed by doubts about the efficacy of our years of work together, and discovered myself having fantasies about sending her to a hospital where she would receive better care. Then I began to feel very angry. Examining this in myself produced understanding and better tolerance of my irritation and frustration. More important, I was able to identify my anger as a response to Ms. D's attempt to enact her organizing omnipotent belief. She said, "If I just persist for long enough, finally you will take care of me and be my mother. I'll make you tell me what to do, and I'll never have to leave you." She was trying to involve me in her omnipotent attempt to force me to love her in the controlling way her parents had loved her. I told her that I was angry with her for pushing me around in this way, for trying to force me to abandon my position as her analyst, and our experience together of my knowledge of her capacity to make her own choices. I pointed out that I would respect those choices, whatever that they might be, but that I would not distort or collude in destroying what we had learned together of her strengths. Ms. D responded with gradual improvement. As her suicidal thoughts and unbearable sleepiness in sessions receded, she remarked one day, "I know you actually do love me, despite my protests to the contrary. It's just that there is that other kind of love that pulls me." She had a long way to go as she moved back and forth between her omnipotent belief that relationships are based on sadomasochistic forcing and her growing security in collaborative relationships at work, with friends, and in treatment. Ms. D maintained her progressive momentum at her second attempt to move from pre-termination into a termination phase.
The termination phase. Mr. X had chosen a date about 3 months ahead, and the first month of the termination phase was marked by intensive reworking of old conflicts over loss. Working through intense feelings about his mother and his former therapist allowed him to regain and consolidate feelings of objective love for himself and his analyst. Then he began to talk of his post-analytic plans, both professional and personal. At first, this seemed an appropriate and progressive step. Gradually, however, the sessions became filled with ruminations about what he should do in regard to this or that hypothetical post-analytic occurrence. Should he seek an academic hospital post? Should he take it? What about his patients? And so forth. The present experience of termination seemed to have been swallowed up in concerns about the future. From the beginnings of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy, there have been many examples of good therapies being ruined by misconceived and mishandled terminations. We have written about the concepts of the Therapeutic Alliance and the two systems as guides through the labyrinth of competing and contradictory technical papers on termination. Because the termination phase can generate the most intense counter-reactive and counter-transference feelings of any phase of treatment, This is often a good time to seek consultation with a colleague. At the very least, we must think through what we really lose at the end of a treatment and what we imagine or fear we are losing. We are helped in this effort by staying mindful of the Therapeutic Alliance tasks for this phase and distinguishing, as in the earlier phases, between love as part of an open system and the hostile control that masquerades as love, but in fact emanates from a closed, omnipotent, sadomasochistic system. Setting aside infantile wishes from all levels of development, including beliefs in the omnipotence of the self or of others, seems a frightening and painful loss for both patient and analyst. But the work of the earlier phases has allowed for the establishment of alternative sources of security and self-esteem in realistic achievements and representations. Much of the work of the termination phase is drawing the distinction between the illusory loss of unreal fantasy gains and the real loss of the setting, the analyst, and the special therapeutic relationship. During Mr. X's sessions, I too found myself drifting into the future, joining him in analyzing his putative post-analytic conflicts. I then noticed that I seemed to have lost some loving feelings for him in the present. One evening I was rereading an article by Judith Viorst about the fantasies of analysts during the termination phase. I had used her material in a number of my own papers, and I thought I was going over it for a course I was preparing. I made no connection with my patient, until I found myself thinking repeatedly about Viorst's report of an analyst who fantasied that his patient would meet and marry the analyst's grown-up child. I wondered then if that was my wish for an altered relationship after the analysis. Mr. X and I would stay together as father and son. I was not only avoiding my own sadness and allowing him to avoid his, I had also relinquished my objective love for him as an autonomous, accomplished person who no longer needed me. I had a fantasy that might have seemed benign and loving, but it was actually an omnipotent desire to control my patient's future. In the next session, I said we both seemed to be working very hard to avoid our feelings about ending. Mr. X sighed and said that he realized he was trying to leave me in a way he had always left everyone, without any feelings of love or sadness or loss. He went on to say that his treatment provided him a chance to leave while loving and feeling love. It would be sad, but sad is better than dead, and there is no sadness without love.
Post-termination phase. Post-termination is not, strictly speaking, a phase of treatment, but much of the work of analysis is shaped by its goals and measured by the quality of life afterward. Analysis is not an end in itself, but a means to reach the goal of restoration to the path of progressive development. Implicitly, the entire course of an analysis is a preparation for post-treatment living. The analyst's alliance task in this phase is to maintain a stance as the patient's therapist, despite any internal or external pressures to alter the relationship. Continuing positive growth after treatment is possible only when there is some continuity between the time of analysis and post-analytic life. Many patients have had the omnipotent fantasy image of analysis as something terribly painful to be endured in return for some subsequent prize, such as perfect happiness, no further conflict, or an ongoing altered relationship with the analyst as friend, spouse, or lover. Analysts, too, have fantasies of post-treatment contact that have to be worked through during the pre-termination and termination phases, if the termination is to be truly constructive. If we add to the tasks of the Therapeutic Alliance the distinction we have drawn between love as an obstacle and love as an enhancement, then we have a set of affective guidelines for our actions. The term boundary violation usually refers to sexual actions during treatment. Whether patient and analyst can properly have a sexual relationship or marry after termination is a gray area of denial, avoidance, and confusion. Recently, we have written about the history of such occurrences in psychoanalysis and noted that avoidance of discussion about this topic makes the technique of termination difficult to teach and learn. A recent article by Applebaum and Jorgensen debates whether consensual sexual relations between psychiatrists and former patients should be legal after 1 or 2 years. The International Psychoanalytical Association, some 9 or 10 decades after its founding, has proposed a set of ethical principles that prescribes sexual relations with a patient or student under treatment or supervision. However, the principles leave open the question of whether and when sexual relations after treatment or supervision might be ethically acceptable. Weiner notes that analysts in the US and Europe seem to differ on this matter. Using the distinctions we have drawn, we suggest that such altered relationships destroy objective love, debase and deny the uniqueness of the therapeutic relationship, and can validate the pathological belief that submissive masochistic suffering has brought as its reward the fulfillment of one's desires. Equally disruptive of post-analytic growth for both parties can be the analyst's denial that respect, admiration, and objective love continue after analysis. We have heard of many instances in which former patients have felt hurt and puzzled by an analyst's apparent coolness or lack of acknowledgement on chance meeting. The current controversy over analyst-initiated follow-up might be elucidated by considering whether this departure from mutuality meets the patient's need for post-analytic growth or serves the analyst's need to maintain a delusion of omnipotence. So in conclusion, we have used the framework of the Therapeutic Alliance and the idea of 2 systems of self-regulation to begin an examination of the place of the analyst's love in the process and outcome of treatment. We noted that until recently, the analyst's love has tended to be relegated to the realm of countertransference, to be mastered but kept out of the analysis. With current shifts in technique, the emphasis has been on the analyst's erotic countertransference, which we and many others see as a sadomasochistic sexual engagement. Our view of 2 systems of self-regulation has allowed us to suggest some criteria for differentiating sadomasochistic enthrallment in a closed system governed by a delusion of omnipotence from mutually enhancing love in an open system in which self-esteem is regulated by reality-attuned respect between patient and analyst. Implicit in our presentation is the assumption that psychoanalysis can be both a cognitive affective restoration to a path of progressive development and a growth-enhancing developmental experience for both patient and analyst. From the very beginning of psychoanalysis as a form of treatment, it was understood that change occurs within and through a relationship, that insight and relationship are not incompatible forces for change. In fact, both are necessary. We have tried here to create a theoretical space in which to examine the analyst's love for the patient, and to illustrate how that love grows in relation to the alliance tasks of each phase of treatment. We have also emphasized the ongoing need to distinguish between omnipotent power relations in a closed system of functioning disguised as love, and the growth-enhancing love that we allocate to open system functioning. We are suggesting that meaningful and lasting change occurs in the context of the analyst's reality-based respect, admiration, and love for the patient. Thank you.